Samuel Adams. As a student at Harvard, Samuel Adams was introduced to the writings of Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. In particular, Locke's argument that every man is born with certain inalienable rights that can't be taken away, and that governments exist by the consent of the people, leading Adams to write his 1743 master's thesis on the legality of resisting British rule. Upon his father's death in 1748, Adams proved to be a lackluster businessman when he bankrupted the family brewing business, followed by an equally botched job as a Boston tax collector, where his inept accounting came up thousands of pounds short. What Adams did excel at was writing, and as tensions began to rise between colonists and their British overlords, Adams became a leading voice in the push for American independence. By the mid-1760s, after the British imposed taxes on the colonies with the intent of paying down debts accrued during the 7 Years' War, Adams wrote a string of newspaper articles under the pen names Vindex and Candidus, denouncing British taxation without representation in Parliament, at the same time joining an underground group of activists known as the Loyal Nine, which would later morph into the Sons of Liberty. When British Parliament yet again burdened the colonies with the Tea Act of 1773, Adams encouraged his fellow Bostonians to impede tea shipments by the British East India Company, leading Adams to write after the Boston Tea Party that the protesters have acted upon pure and upright principle. By 1775, British authorities had grown weary of Adams and his activism, and when the British sent a force of soldiers to arrest Adams and fellow activist John Hancock in Lexington, Massachusetts, the ensuing battles of Lexington and Concord proved to be the ignition point in the Revolutionary War. A vocal delegate in the Continental Congress, Adams signed the Declaration of Independence and later helped pen the Articles of Confederation. After stepping down from the Continental Congress in 1781, Adams spent his later years in Massachusetts politics, serving as president of the state senate and later lieutenant governor under Governor John Hancock, passing away at age 81 on October 2, 1803, making Samuel Adams one of the clearest voices in America's push for independence. The Sons of Liberty. Stemming from a secret group of Boston-based patriots known as the Loyal Nine, the group soon spread throughout the colonies as the Sons of Liberty, who became instigators and provocateurs against British rule and taxation, using civil disobedience and threats of violence to intimidate colonists loyal to the British Crown. Led by such founding father notables as Sam Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, and Benedict Arnold, the group drew first blood after the Stamp Act was imposed in December of 1765, when the Sons sent a letter to the newly appointed stamp tax collector, Andrew Oliver, demanding that he resign from his position or face the likelihood of violence. After Oliver's house was ransacked by the Sons of Liberty, he appeared as ordered at the Liberty Tree in Boston's South End, publicly resigning his post before a cheering crowd of some 2,000 colonists, despite a pounding rainstorm. While George Washington led the Patriots to victory in the Revolutionary War, the truth is that there might not have been a fight to begin with, writes historian Les Standiford, had it not been for the work of Sam Adams. By way of example, after Parliament passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, imposing further taxes on such goods as china and glass, Adams organized a boycott against British goods in Massachusetts, sending young boys to smash windows and terrorize shopkeepers who failed to comply with the Sons' demands. As the Sons evolved their philosophies against British rule and taxation without representation in Parliament, they soon rejected the British argument that colonial taxes were necessary to pay down British debts incurred during the French and Indian War, concluding over the Sons' growing years of activism. that the only real answer was independence from Great Britain. Fearing a loss of standing in the eyes of other Sons chapters in New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere, after Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, Adams encouraged his fellow Bostonian Sons to impede tea shipments by the British East India Company, leading Adams to write after the Boston Tea Party that the protesters have acted on pure and upright principle. By 1775, British authorities had grown weary of the Sons of Liberty, sending a force of soldiers to Lexington, Massachusetts, to arrest both Adams and Hancock. But when Patriot militiamen pushed back against the arresting party, the resulting battles of Lexington and Concord proved to be the opening volley in the Revolutionary War, making the Sons of Liberty a leading force behind America's push for independence. The Articles of Confederation. Suspicious over the sort of centralized power that had brought the colonies to war with Great Britain, and while the Continental Congress held firm in its belief that the 13 states should remain sovereign and independent, Congress also saw the need for a strong central government with the singular goal of defeating the British in the Revolutionary War. In response, Congress worked through 6 drafts of the Articles of Confederation, beginning with the first one presented by Ben Franklin and delivered to Congress in July of 1775, followed by a second and third draft by the Connecticut delegation led by Silas Deane. Pennsylvania delegate John Dickinson presented a fourth draft in June of 1776, shortly before the American Declaration of Independence the following month, followed by 2 more revisions that were approved for submission to the states in November of 1777. All states had approved the Articles by 1779, except for holdout Maryland, who contested claims by other states regarding their attachment to Western lands. In response, Thomas Jefferson succeeded in persuading Virginia to yield their claims on Western lands, which in turn saw Maryland's ratification of the Articles on March 1, 1781. Once ratified, the Articles of Confederation granted Congress jurisdiction over foreign relations and diplomacy, along with the authority to make treaties and alliances for the individual states' common defense. It further allowed the federal government to maintain an army and a navy, the right to coin money, the creation of a national postal service, the management of Indian affairs, and the establishment of admiralty courts to adjudicate disputes between states. The Articles further required each state to honor trade and movement of citizens between states without restriction. Ratified several months before Britain's 1781 surrender at Yorktown, the Articles of Confederation provided a loose framework of federal jurisdiction, but since the document gave Congress no authority to demand money or troops from individual states, not to mention any provision for executive and judiciary branches of government, by 1786, it became increasingly apparent that without a stronger document, the young nation would soon splinter and fail. In response, on May 25, 1787, delegates representing every state except Rhode Island convened in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Congress, making the Articles of Confederation a temporary yet vital precursor to the American Constitution of today. The Boston Massacre. Tensions ran high in early 1770 Boston, with more than 2,000 British soldiers occupying the city of 16,000 colonists. American colonialists became ever more vocal over repressive British tax laws like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, prompting the Sons of Liberty to coin the phrase "no taxation without representation." conflicts were on the rise between British soldiers and irate colonists, as well as skirmishes between patriots and those colonialists who remained loyal to the British Crown. On February 22nd, a mob of patriots attacked loyalist Ebenezer Richardson's store, prompting Richardson to fire his gun through a front window of his nearby home. Richardson's shot took the life of 11-year-old Christopher Sider, which further escalated patriotic pushback over British rule. On the frigid, snowy evening of March 5, 1770, Private Hugh White was the only British soldier guarding the King's money stored inside the Custom House on King Street. It wasn't long before angry colonists began taunting him with insults and threats of violence, leading White to call for reinforcements. Fearing that colonial rioters would take the King's money, Captain Thomas Preston arrived on scene with several soldiers, taking up defensive positions in front of the Custom House. Tensions continued to escalate when colonialists struck the soldiers with clubs and sticks, and while reports differed regarding what happened next, someone supposedly said the word fire. After the first shot rang out, other soldiers opened fire as well, killing 5 colonialists and wounding 6 others. Within hours, Preston and his soldiers were arrested, while the days and months that followed brought with it a massive uptick in colonial support for Sons of Liberty leaders such as John Hancock and Samuel Adams, which in turn created so much unrest in Boston that the British retreated from the town for Fort Williams. Although far from a loyalist, John Adams would defend Preston and his soldiers in a court of law, insistent that the British be given a fair and unbiased trial. After witness Richard Palms testified that the word fire was given after shots had already rang out, Adams argued that reasonable doubt existed, obliging the court to find all men not guilty except for 2, who were found guilty of manslaughter and were branded on the thumbs as first offenders per English law. Nevertheless, the fuse of rebellion had been lit, stirring tensions over the next 5 years, which would lead to the Boston Tea Party, the formation of the Continental Congress, and the American Revolution. The Coercive Acts. After the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 British tea ships and dumped 342 crates of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of the Tea Act, the British imposed 4 Impunity Acts intended to make an example out of Massachusetts, thereby reversing the trend of colonial resistance to parliamentary authority, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764. First came the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until damages from the Boston Tea Party could be paid. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which restricted democratic town meetings in the offending colony, while turning the Governor's Council into the only official governing body. The Administration of Justice Act was next on the punishment block, which made British officials immune to criminal prosecution in Massachusetts, while the Quartering Act required colonialists to house and quarter British troops on demand. The Quebec Act, which extended freedom of worship to Catholics in Canada, as well as granting Canadians the continuation of their judicial system, was tacked onto the 4 Coercive Acts, which as a whole became known by the colonialists as the Intolerable Acts. More important than the acts themselves was the colonists' response to the legislation. Parliament hoped that the acts would cut radicalized Boston and New England off from the rest of the colonies, fully expectant that the remaining colonies would abandon their Bostonian brothers for fear they too would fall under Parliament's draconian measures and the negative impact of British martial law. Instead, the acts triggered outrage and indignation throughout the 13 colonies as they rushed to the city's defense, sending in supplies before forming their own provincial congresses to discuss British misrule and mobilize resistance against their British overlords. In September of 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and began orchestrating a united resistance to British rule in America, later sparking the American Revolutionary War in April of 1775. The Great Fire of New York City. After hostilities commenced at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, Patriots quickly ousted Loyalists from New York City's sprawling metropolis of some 25,000 colonials, shoehorned into some 4,000 homes and businesses. By the summer of 1776, however, British General William Howe initiated a campaign to take control of the strategically important port city from his stronghold on Staten Island, and after Howe successfully captured Long Island, Commander-in-Chief George Washington recognized the inevitability of Howe's intention to seize the city, moving his troops 10 miles north to Harlem Heights. After General Nathanael Greene and New York's John Jay embraced the notion of burning the city to deny its benefits to the British, a move which was quickly rejected by the Second Continental Congress. When the British successfully took the city on September 15th, 6 days later, fire broke out on the evening of September 21st in a wooden structure called the Fighting Cock's Tavern, a funhouse frequented by some of the city's most disreputable residents. Fueled by strong winds out of the southwest, fire quickly engulfed a good portion of the city, destroying upwards of 25% of a city already desperately short on warehouse and housing space. Residents poured onto the streets with their most valued possessions, taking shelter in present-day City Hall Park to wait out the firestorm. A wind shift the following day allowed British and American bucket brigaders to snuff out the last remnants of the fire, leading the British to believe that the fire was intentionally set by renegade patriots. Questioning some 200 suspected patriots, yet never filing any charges, General Howe wrote that a most bad attempt was made by a number of wretches to burn the town, while Royal Governor William Tryon went so far as to point the finger at Washington himself. In his own defense, Washington would write in a letter to John Hancock on September 22nd, announcing his clear denial of any knowledge of the fire's origin or causation, while in a second letter to his cousin Lund, Washington later wrote that Providence, or some good honest fellow, has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves, making the Great Fire of New York City a lasting mystery in early American history. The life and works of Thomas Paine. Historian Saul K. Padover described Thomas Paine as a corset maker by trade, a journalist by profession, and a propagandist by inclination, which quite adequately sums up the life and work of a man deeply ensconced in political activism and the Enlightenment-era ideals of transnational human rights. Born in Thetford, England in 1736, Thomas Paine migrated to the American colonies at the age of 38 with the help of Benjamin Franklin, arriving just in time to fuel the fires of the American Revolution. Almost every colonialist rebel read or listened to his powerful dissertation entitled Common Sense, which was by far the best-selling pamphlet in all of the colonies. Common Sense was so influential to the American Revolution that John Adams said of the work, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Paine's next successful work was a series of pamphlets known collectively as the American Crisis, which further inflamed pro-revolutionary sentiment in the colonies. After successfully assisting independence in America, Paine moved to France for most of the 1790s, where he became a leading proponent in the French Revolution. After penning The Rights of Man in 1791, in defense of the French Revolution against its critics, his attacks on Anglo-Irish conservative writer Edmund Burke led to a trial and conviction in absentia in England for the crime of seditious libel. Worried by the possibility that the French Revolution might well spread into England, the British government of William Pitt the Younger attempted to suppress Paine's philosophies, which advocated the right of citizens to overthrow their governments. In 1792, England issued a writ for his arrest, which forced Paine to flee to France permanently in September of that same year. Despite his inability to speak the French language, he was quickly elected to the French National Convention. Deemed an enemy of France by the ruling authorities in the country, the Montagnard, led by Maximilien Robespierre, in December of 1793, Paine was arrested and taken to Luxembourg prison in Paris, where he continued to write The Age of Reason, which challenged institutionalized Christian dogma and the legitimacy of the Bible. After future U.S. President James Monroe used his diplomatic connections to secure Paine's release from prison, Paine published Agrarian Justice in 1797, which challenged the origins and legitimacy of property rights and introduced the concept of a guaranteed minimum income through a one-time inheritance tax on landowners. He returned to the U.S. in 1802, and upon his death 7 years later, only 6 people attended his funeral due to his staunch ridicule of the Christian faith. The Newburgh Conspiracy. After British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown on September 19, 1781, the American Revolutionary War dragged on until the signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. In the meantime, the Continental Congress continued its disgraceful slow funding of military pay and its promise to fund military pensions, which by March of 1783 led Continental Army officers to circulate an anonymous petition condemning Congress and calling for a conspiratorial revolt and possible mutiny of service to their country. In response, Commander-in-Chief George Washington, perhaps the most revered man in the annals of American history, convened a meeting of his officers at Newburgh, New York, on March 15, 1783, a mere 6 months before the formal end of war, announcing to his assembled men that, by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. Let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures, which viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country, and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress. Washington then removed a letter from his breast pocket, written by a member of Congress, hesitating while he fumbled for a pair of reading glasses from another pocket, announcing almost apologetically, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown old in the service of my country, and now find that I am growing blind." Washington's comment brought tears to the eyes of nearly every man in the room, who realized as a collective body of men that their commander-in-chief had given much more than any of them in the service to their new nation. Within a matter of minutes, Washington's officers voted unanimously in support of Congress and service to their newborn country, making Washington's Newburgh Conspiracy speech a little-known but highly impactful turning point in the birth of a new republic. The resignation of George Washington. In the summer of 1781, British General George Cornwallis marched an approximate 8,000-man army into the Virginia port city of Yorktown, expecting to meet British ships sent from New York to replenish his badly reduced stores of food and ammunition. By early October, however, with no British ships on the horizon, General George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau lay siege to Yorktown, by surrounding the city with 17,000 French and American troops, while French Admiral François de Grasse patrolled the Chesapeake Bay and the mouth of the York River, intent on blocking any British attempts to flee. 3 weeks later, on October 19th of that same year, Cornwallis agreed to Washington's terms of surrender, as laid out in his Articles of Capitulation, effectively ending the Revolutionary War. Peace negotiations stalled for the next 2 years in Paris due to Britain's initial refusal to acknowledge American independence and sovereignty, a point which Americans John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay refused to remove from the negotiating table. After the election of a new, more pro-American parliament was seated in London, led by newly elected British Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, who saw the chance to build a lucrative trade alliance with the new nation, minus the cost of civil and military oversight. The British signed the Treaty of Paris at the Hôtel de York on September 3, 1783, before its ratification by the Continental Congress on January 14, 1784, from their seat at the Maryland State House in Annapolis. In between the formalities of ending the war, on December 23, 1783, standing before the Continental Congress, George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, expressing his desire to return to his beloved Mount Vernon as a private citizen, an event which historians consider a lasting testament to Washington's Republican values by handing his power back to the federal government. I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress, he addressed the body of legislators, and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me, and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country. Little did Washington know that his service would continue as the nation's first two-term president, making the resignation of George Washington a turning point moment during the birth of a nation. Today on the Daily Dose, Thomas Jefferson. After graduating from the College of William and Mary in 1762, Thomas Jefferson studied law under Virginia attorney George Wythe before opening his own practice in 1767. Well respected from an early age, from 1769 to 1775, Jefferson became a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, later renamed the Virginia House of Delegates after independence from Great Britain. Inheriting land near Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson's keen interest in architecture and gardening led to the construction of his beloved Monticello, or Little Mountain in the Italian, where he and his young wife Martha gave birth to 6 children before Martha's untimely death at the tender age of 33. While only 2 of their children would survive into adulthood, Jefferson was so devastated by the loss of his beloved wife that he would never marry again. As war broke out with Great Britain, in 1775, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where he penned the first draft of the Declaration of Independence at 33 years of age, resigning the following year when he was re-elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. From 1779 to 1781, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia before landing his second stint in Congress from 1783 to 1784. A year later, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as U.S. Minister to France, and upon his return to the States in 1789, President George Washington appointed him as the nation's first Secretary of State, where he frequently bucked heads with Secretary of the Treasury and staunch big government Federalist Alexander Hamilton over foreign affairs, interpretations of the Constitution, and the size and authority of the federal government. Hamilton's insistence on a strong federal government would lead Jefferson to co-found the Democratic-Republican Party, which was an ideological precursor of today's Republican Party. In the presidential election of 1796, Jefferson defeated John Adams for the office of vice president, later running a second time against Adams for president during the election of 1800, which proved to be a bitter fight between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, just a few short years after both political sides had been so united in their revolutionary calls for independence. The crowning achievement of Jefferson's first term was his successful orchestration of the Louisiana Purchase from France, followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition into the newly purchased lands, an 8,000-mile journey which took them to the Pacific Ocean and back. Handily re-elected in 1804, Jefferson's second-term focus was to steer the United States safely away from involvement in the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, which at one point or another dragged much of Europe into the conflict. After turning down a third term as president, Jefferson returned home to his beloved Monticello, where he continued to pursue his interest in architecture, music, reading, and gardening, at the same time helping to found the University of Virginia, which opened its doors for its first student body in 1825. After his death on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after he signed the Declaration of Independence, his surviving estate was heavily mired in debt due to a lifetime of extravagant spending, which in turn required that his slaves be sold at auction alongside his land holdings, art, and furnishings, forever cementing Thomas Jefferson into the early history of a newly formed nation. And there you have it, the life and works of Thomas Jefferson, today in the Daily Dose. If you want early access to Daily Dose documentaries before they're made publicly available, consider supporting us on Patreon so that you too could feed the filmmakers who feed your brain.